From Washington to Biden, every president has shaped history, some through courage, others through controversy. But how did this office evolve from humble beginnings into the most powerful position on earth? Tonight, discover the untold story of the U.S. presidents, the battles, the breakthroughs, and the moments that define nations. Before we begin, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a journey through history. Now, let's dive in. The United States of America was a fragile experiment in the late 18th century. After winning independence from the British Empire, the newly freed colonies faced daunting questions. What kind of government should they create? Who would lead them? Could power be entrusted to a single individual without repeating the tyranny they had just fought to escape? The answer came slowly and carefully. Initially, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president at all. The states remained loosely connected, and power rested primarily with local governments. But chaos soon crept in. Disputes over borders, trade, and taxes made it clear that a stronger central authority was needed. This realization led to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, a pivotal moment that would shape the nation's destiny. At that convention, delegates debated fiercely. They wanted balance, a leader strong enough to unify the nation but constrained enough to avoid despotism. Thus, the role of the President of the United States was born. The Constitution outlined specific powers, including commanding the military, making treaties, with Senate approval, and executing laws passed by Congress. Importantly, however, the President could not make laws alone or rule indefinitely. When it came time to select the first person for this powerful new position, there was little debate. George Washington, the revered general of the Revolutionary War, was the unanimous choice. His reputation for integrity and humility made him the ideal candidate. In 1789, Washington took the oath of office in New York City, then the nation's capital. There was no precedent for what he was about to do. Every action would set a standard. Washington approached his duties with caution and respect for the limits of power. He established key traditions, such as forming a cabinet of advisors, delivering the inaugural address, and, perhaps most importantly, stepping down after 2 terms. This last act, declining to seek a 3rd term in 1796, set a powerful example for peaceful transitions of power, which became a bedrock principle of American democracy. His presidency was not without challenges. The new government faced economic struggles, foreign policy dilemmas, and deep internal divisions. Washington navigated these issues with pragmatism. He remained above partisan politics, though factions soon emerged. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong national government and ties with Britain. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, advocated for states' rights and closer relations with revolutionary France. Despite these divisions, Washington's farewell address warned against political parties and entangling alliances abroad, advice future presidents often ignored. Following Washington, the nation elected John Adams, the first vice president, as the second president. Adams, a brilliant yet prickly figure, faced his own trials. His tenure was marked by conflict with France, which spiraled into the so-called Quasi-War. To manage domestic dissent, Adams signed the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which critics claimed infringed upon free speech and civil liberties. This damaged his popularity and led to his defeat after 1 term. In 1800, power passed peacefully to Thomas Jefferson, signaling that the young republic could indeed handle change without bloodshed. This peaceful transfer became a defining feature of the presidency, one envied by nations around the world. Jefferson's time in office brought further evolution. Though initially a proponent of limited government, he oversaw the massive Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the country. His decision to send Lewis and Clark to explore the new territory reflected the presidency's expanding reach. By the early 19th century, the office of the president had already grown far beyond what the founders had originally imagined. Yet, the balance of power remained a constant concern. Each president would face the same delicate task: to wield authority without abusing it. From Washington's stoic restraint to Jefferson's pragmatic expansion, the presidency had become the anchor of the American experiment. But challenges loomed on the horizon, challenges that would test the very fabric of the Union. As America pushed westward in the early 19th century, the presidency evolved to meet new demands. The young republic, still fragile, now had to grapple with complex issues: territorial expansion, growing regional tensions, and the persistent moral dilemma of slavery. James Madison, who succeeded Jefferson in 1809, inherited a nation caught between European powers. Britain's interference with American shipping and impressment of sailors triggered the War of 1812. Though the war had mixed results militarily, the successful defense of key territories and the burning of Washington, D.C. hardened the national identity. Madison emerged as a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the face of global empires, America would stand its ground. Next came James Monroe, whose presidency, 1817 to 1825, became known as the era of good feelings. Though political divisions briefly subsided, serious issues simmered beneath the surface. Monroe's most lasting legacy came through foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This declaration warned European powers against further colonization in the Western Hemisphere, asserting America's growing confidence on the global stage. Domestically, though, cracks deepened. The question of slavery's expansion into new states threatened national unity. Enter Andrew Jackson, the first People's President, elected in 1828. A fiery populist and war hero, Jackson redefined the presidency in ways that both energized and alarmed Americans. He expanded executive power, famously using the veto more aggressively than his predecessors, and took on the national bank, which he viewed as a corrupt tool of elites. Jackson's presidency also bore dark marks. His support for the Indian Removal Act led to the forced relocation of Native Americans, culminating in the tragic Trail of Tears. For many, Jackson embodied both the best and worst of American democracy, representing the common man while wielding power ruthlessly. The next decades saw rising sectional tensions. As new states joined the Union, each decision about whether they would allow slavery became a flashpoint. James K. Polk, president during the 1840s, presided over the most aggressive period of expansion. Under Polk, the United States added vast territories following the Mexican-American War, fulfilling the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was destined to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But each new state rekindled fierce debates. Would it be free or slave-holding? The fragile compromises of the early 19th century, like the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, only delayed the inevitable reckoning. As the 1850s unfolded, the presidency became increasingly beleaguered. Leaders like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan proved unable or unwilling to resolve the crisis. Buchanan, in particular, presided over a nation teetering on the edge. His failure to address secessionist sentiment allowed tensions to fester dangerously. Then came a leader who would face the Union's darkest hour, Abraham Lincoln. Elected in 1860, Lincoln's victory triggered a chain reaction. Southern states, fearing restrictions on slavery, began to secede. Lincoln's firm stance, that secession was illegal and that the Union must be preserved, set the stage for the Civil War. The war tested everything the presidency had come to represent. Lincoln expanded executive power dramatically. He suspended habeas corpus, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and managed a massive war effort. Yet, even amidst unprecedented authority, he remained committed to democratic ideals. His assassination in 1865 left the nation mourning but also set in motion new challenges. The next presidents would face the daunting task of reconstruction, balancing justice, reconciliation, and rebuilding a shattered nation. By the mid-19th century, the presidency had evolved from a symbol of cautious leadership into a powerful, sometimes controversial force capable of guiding the nation through its gravest crises. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865 left a nation already bleeding from war shattered once more. Into this fragile environment stepped Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union during the war. Johnson inherited the impossible task of leading the country through Reconstruction, the process of reintegrating the seceded states and defining the future of millions of newly freed African Americans. But Johnson's vision clashed with the Republican-controlled Congress. He pushed for leniency toward the South and resisted efforts to secure civil rights for former slaves. His opposition culminated in his impeachment, the first in American history. Though acquitted by just one vote in the Senate, Johnson's presidency ended in disgrace and paralysis. The failure of Reconstruction, and the compromises that followed, allowed discriminatory laws, known as Jim Crow laws, to take root across the South, denying black Americans equality for generations to come. As the 19th century progressed, the presidency gradually shifted focus. The nation was industrializing rapidly, cities were swelling with immigrants, and corporate power grew unchecked. Into this era of change stepped a new breed of presidents. Ulysses S. Grant, a Civil War hero, became president in 1869. Though personally honest and committed to civil rights, his administration was riddled with corruption scandals. Yet, under his watch, important steps were taken to enforce civil rights laws and combat the Ku Klux Klan. By the 1880s and 1890s, the presidency entered what many called a period of relative weakness. Leaders like Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, tragically assassinated early in his term, and Chester A. Arthur presided over a nation more influenced by Congress and big business than by the White House. Yet even during this quieter phase, change brewed. Grover Cleveland, elected in 1884 and again in 1892, became the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. Known for his honesty and fiscal conservatism, Cleveland fought against corruption and excessive government spending, though he did little to address the growing plight of workers and the poor. As America approached the 20th century, energy and ambition returned to the presidency. The Spanish-American War of 1898 thrust the United States onto the global stage. The brief but decisive victory over Spain gave the country new territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Riding this wave of American assertiveness, Theodore Roosevelt, a dynamic and fearless figure, assumed the presidency in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt transformed the office. He saw the presidency as a bully pulpit, a platform to shape public opinion and lead bold initiatives. Roosevelt busted monopolies, pushed for food and drug regulations, and championed conservation, establishing national parks and protecting vast tracts of wilderness. In foreign affairs, he expanded American power, famously adopting the motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." His activism inspired successors. William Howard Taft, though more conservative, continued some of Roosevelt's policies. Yet tensions between the two led Roosevelt to challenge Taft in 1912, splitting the Republican vote and ushering in Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's presidency began with progressive reforms, but world events soon dominated his tenure. When World War I engulfed Europe, Wilson kept the U.S. neutral until 1917, when unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmerman telegram forced America into the conflict. Wilson became the first president to travel to Europe while in office, pushing for his vision of a League of Nations at the Treaty of Versailles. Although the U.S. Senate rejected the League, his global ambitions redefined the presidency as not only a national leader, but also a global one. As Wilson's health faltered after the war, the nation grew weary of international entanglements and reform. The presidency passed into more restrained hands, but the seeds of the modern, activist presidency had been firmly planted. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, Franklin D. Roosevelt remained at the helm of a nation still recovering from the Great Depression. But while Americans slowly regained confidence, a new storm was brewing overseas. Fascism and militarism were on the march. Nazi Germany expanded aggressively under Adolf Hitler, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Imperial Japan pushed into China and the Pacific. War in Europe erupted in 1939, yet the United States initially remained neutral. Roosevelt, however, recognized the threat. He worked carefully to support the Allies without directly dragging America into conflict. Through measures like Lend-Lease, he provided vital aid to Britain and later the Soviet Union, framing it as essential to American security. Still, public opinion remained largely isolationist. Most Americans wanted to avoid another devastating war. That changed in an instant on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The assault devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killed over 2,400 Americans. Roosevelt addressed the nation the following day, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The nation was fully engaged in World War II. Roosevelt's role as commander-in-chief came into full focus. He coordinated massive military mobilization while overseeing an economy converted for total war. Under his leadership, the United States became the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, ships, planes, and weapons on an unprecedented scale. FDR forged close alliances with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, guiding the Allies through critical decisions at wartime conferences like Yalta. At home, the war transformed American society. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Meanwhile, millions of African Americans migrated north seeking jobs, beginning a demographic shift that would reshape politics and culture. Despite these advances, the war years exposed contradictions. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, a dark chapter that Roosevelt authorized under the guise of national security. Civil liberties were tested as the government tightened its grip to ensure victory. In 1944, despite his declining health, Roosevelt won an unprecedented fourth term. His leadership remained crucial as Allied forces liberated Europe and closed in on Japan. But he would not live to see the end of the conflict. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage. The nation mourned deeply. Vice President Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency during this pivotal moment. Truman, once seen as an unremarkable political figure, faced daunting tasks immediately. Just weeks after taking office, he authorized the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to hasten the war's end. Japan soon surrendered, bringing World War II to a close. But peace proved fleeting. Truman's presidency quickly transitioned into a new conflict, the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. Truman, determined to resist the spread of communism, implemented the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to nations threatened by authoritarian regimes. His Marshall Plan aided European recovery and secured allies against Soviet influence. Domestically, Truman faced challenges as soldiers returned home. Strikes, inflation, and racial tensions erupted. He boldly desegregated the armed forces in 1948, signaling the beginning of presidential involvement in civil rights. Despite deep divisions, Truman won re-election in 1948 in a shocking upset against Republican Thomas Dewey, symbolizing the enduring trust Americans placed in presidential leadership during uncertain times. By the dawn of the 1950s, the role of the president had been reshaped once more. No longer merely a national figure, the U.S. president now stood as leader of the free world, balancing domestic responsibilities with global challenges that would define the second half of the 20th century. As the 1920s dawned, Americans yearned for stability and normalcy. The devastation of World War I and the turbulent progressive era had left the nation exhausted. Into this atmosphere stepped Warren G. Harding, who was elected in 1920 on a promise of a return to normalcy. Harding projected warmth and simplicity, but his presidency was marred by scandal. Harding's administration became synonymous with corruption, most infamously the Teapot Dome scandal, where government officials leased oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. Though Harding himself was not directly implicated, the scandal tarnished his legacy. His sudden death in 1923 elevated Vice President Calvin Coolidge to the presidency. Coolidge, known as Silent Cal, embodied the conservative spirit of the age. He believed in limited government, low taxes, and minimal interference in business. Under his watch, the U.S. economy boomed. The Roaring Twenties saw rapid industrial growth, technological advances, and soaring stock markets. Jazz music, flappers, and consumer culture defined the era. Yet, beneath the surface, problems brewed. Wealth was unevenly distributed, farmers faced hard times, and the stock market became increasingly speculative. Coolidge famously remarked, "The business of America is business." But his laissez-faire approach left the nation vulnerable. In 1928, Herbert Hoover, a self-made millionaire and humanitarian, won the presidency. Hoover believed deeply in individualism and voluntary cooperation between government and business. However, within months of his inauguration, disaster struck. The stock market crash of 1929 triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic collapse in American history. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Hoover, true to his principles, resisted large-scale government intervention. He believed recovery would come naturally, and that too much aid would undermine American self-reliance. But as the crisis deepened, despair swept the nation. Shantytowns known as Hoovervilles sprang up across the country. Breadlines and soup kitchens became common sights. Hoover's measured, cautious responses seemed painfully inadequate in the face of mass suffering. In 1932, the American people demanded change. They found it in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a charismatic and optimistic leader who promised a New Deal for the American people. Roosevelt's landslide victory marked a decisive turning point not only for the nation but for the presidency itself. FDR's approach was radically different. He immediately launched bold and unprecedented actions. Within his first 100 days, Roosevelt pushed through sweeping legislation aimed at stabilizing the banks, creating jobs, and providing relief to struggling Americans. He communicated directly with the public through his famous fireside chats, radio broadcasts that reassured the nation and explained complex policies in plain language. The president, once a distant figure in Washington, now felt like a neighbor speaking intimately to millions. Through agencies like the Civilian Conservation Corps (CCC) and the Works Progress Administration (WPA), Roosevelt's New Deal put millions to work building infrastructure, preserving the environment, and stimulating economic recovery. Social Security was established, providing safety nets for the elderly and unemployed. Yet Roosevelt's activism sparked fierce opposition. Critics accused him of overstepping his constitutional authority. His 1937 attempt to pack the Supreme Court, adding justices more favorable to his policies, backfired and damaged his political capital. Still, the New Deal reshaped the role of government and the presidency. No longer was the president merely an enforcer of laws. He became the chief architect of national policy, expected to solve the nation's deepest problems. By the late 1930s, as economic recovery remained uneven and war clouds gathered over Europe, Roosevelt prepared to face new and even greater challenges. His leadership during the Depression had transformed the presidency forever, but even that would pale compared to what lay ahead. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, Franklin D. Roosevelt remained at the helm of a nation still recovering from the Great Depression. But while Americans slowly regained confidence, a new storm was brewing overseas. Fascism and militarism were on the march. Nazi Germany expanded aggressively under Adolf Hitler, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Imperial Japan pushed into China and the Pacific. War in Europe erupted in 1939, yet the United States initially remained neutral. Roosevelt, however, recognized the threat. He worked carefully to support the Allies without directly dragging America into conflict. Through measures like Lend-Lease, he provided vital aid to Britain and later the Soviet Union, framing it as essential to American security. Still, public opinion remained largely isolationist. Most Americans wanted to avoid another devastating war. That changed in an instant on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The assault devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killed over 2,400 Americans. Roosevelt addressed the nation the following day, delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The nation was fully engaged in World War II. Roosevelt's role as commander-in-chief came into full focus. He coordinated massive military mobilization while overseeing an economy converted for total war. Under his leadership, the United States became the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, ships, planes, and weapons on an unprecedented scale. FDR forged close alliances with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, guiding the Allies through critical decisions at wartime conferences like Yalta. At home, the war transformed American society. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Meanwhile, millions of African Americans migrated north seeking jobs, beginning a demographic shift that would reshape politics and culture. Despite these advances, the war years exposed contradictions. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, a dark chapter that Roosevelt authorized under the guise of national security. Civil liberties were tested as the government tightened its grip to ensure victory. In 1944, despite his declining health, Roosevelt won an unprecedented fourth term. His leadership remained crucial as Allied forces liberated Europe and closed in on Japan. But he would not live to see the end of the conflict. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage. The nation mourned deeply. Vice President Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency during this pivotal moment. Truman, once seen as an unremarkable political figure, faced daunting tasks immediately. Just weeks after taking office, he authorized the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to hasten the war's end. Japan soon surrendered, bringing World War II to a close. But peace proved fleeting. Truman's presidency quickly transitioned into a new conflict, the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. Truman, determined to resist the spread of communism, implemented the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to nations threatened by authoritarian regimes. His Marshall Plan aided European recovery and secured allies against Soviet influence. Domestically, Truman faced challenges as soldiers returned home. Strikes, inflation, and racial tensions erupted. He boldly desegregated the armed forces in 1948, signaling the beginning of presidential involvement in civil rights. Despite deep divisions, Truman won re-election in 1948 in a shocking upset against Republican Thomas Dewey, symbolizing the enduring trust Americans placed in presidential leadership during uncertain times. By the dawn of the 1950s, the role of the president had been reshaped once more. No longer merely a national figure, the U.S. president now stood as leader of the free world, balancing domestic responsibilities with global challenges that would define the second half of the 20th century. By the mid-1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson had firmly grasped the reins of presidential power. Following Kennedy's assassination, Johnson seized the moment to push through landmark legislation. His Great Society programs sought to eradicate poverty, expand education, and provide health care through initiatives like Medicare and Medicaid. Most historically significant was his commitment to civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled barriers preventing African Americans from voting. Johnson's domestic achievements were monumental, yet his presidency became increasingly defined by a far more divisive issue: Vietnam. The conflict in Southeast Asia, initially a limited engagement, escalated dramatically under his watch. Johnson, determined to prevent the spread of communism, committed hundreds of thousands of American troops. He framed the war as a test of American resolve in the Cold War struggle. But Vietnam proved to be a quagmire. Nightly television broadcasts brought images of violence into American living rooms. As casualties mounted and victory remained elusive, public support eroded. Massive protests erupted across college campuses and cities. Johnson, once the master of American politics, saw his popularity plummet. In 1968, he shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. The turmoil continued with the election of Richard Nixon later that year. Nixon promised to restore law and order and achieve peace with honor, in Vietnam. His strategy, known as Vietnamization, involved gradually withdrawing American troops while transferring combat duties to South Vietnamese forces. Nixon's foreign policy achievements were notable. He opened diplomatic relations with China in 1972, a groundbreaking move that reshaped global alliances. He also negotiated détente with the Soviet Union, leading to arms control agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I. Yet Nixon's presidency, despite its successes, became forever tainted by scandal. His re-election in 1972 was overshadowed by the Watergate break-in, in which operatives tied to his campaign were caught attempting to wiretap the Democratic National Committee headquarters. As investigations unfolded, the extent of the administration's efforts to cover up its involvement became clear. Secret recordings from the Oval Office revealed Nixon's participation in the cover-up. Faced with certain impeachment, Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign from office, leaving in disgrace on August 9, 1974. His departure deeply shook Americans' faith in the presidency. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed office and sought to heal the nation. His controversial decision to pardon Nixon, however, generated backlash and cost him politically. Ford's presidency, though marked by integrity and steadiness, was burdened by economic woes, including inflation and unemployment. In 1976, Americans turned to an outsider. Jimmy Carter, a former governor of Georgia and peanut farmer, ran as a Washington outsider who would restore honesty and compassion to government. Carter's presidency focused on human rights, energy conservation, and improving relations with foreign nations. Notably, Carter brokered the Camp David Accords, bringing peace between Egypt and Israel, a rare triumph in Middle East diplomacy. Yet, domestic challenges plagued his term. An energy crisis led to fuel shortages and rising prices. Inflation soared, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan reignited Cold War tensions. Perhaps most damaging was the Iran hostage crisis. After Iranian revolutionaries seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, 52 Americans were held captive for 444 days. Carter's inability to resolve the crisis decisively eroded public confidence. By 1980, the mood of the nation had shifted. Many Americans felt demoralized by economic hardship, foreign policy setbacks, and a perceived decline in national strength. They yearned for bold, optimistic leadership, and they would find it in a former Hollywood actor who promised to restore America's greatness. In 1980, Americans overwhelmingly elected Ronald Reagan, a charismatic former actor and California governor, who campaigned on optimism, patriotism, and conservative values. Reagan promised to restore American strength and pride, declaring that, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." Reagan's presidency, beginning in 1981, marked a decisive shift toward free market principles. He implemented sweeping tax cuts, deregulated industries, and promoted a philosophy of supply-side economics, often referred to as Reaganomics. Supporters credited his policies with spurring economic growth and curbing inflation, though critics argued they widened income inequality and increased national debt. Internationally, Reagan took a hard stance against the Soviet Union. He famously labeled it the evil empire, and ramped up defense spending to levels unseen since World War II. His Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI dubbed Star Wars, aimed to create a missile defense system in space, though critics questioned its feasibility. However, Reagan was also pragmatic. As Soviet leadership changed in the mid-1980s, a new opportunity arose. Mikhail Gorbachev, the reform-minded Soviet leader, introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Reagan and Gorbachev developed a personal rapport, holding a series of summits and signing the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty in 1987, the first agreement to actually reduce nuclear arsenals. Reagan's presidency ended on a note of triumph. The Cold War tensions eased significantly, and democracy movements blossomed in Eastern Europe. His 1987 speech at the Berlin Wall, where he famously declared, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," became an enduring symbol of his presidency. In 1988, Reagan's vice president, George H. W. Bush, succeeded him. A decorated World War II veteran and experienced statesman, Bush promised a kinder, gentler nation. His presidency would witness momentous global transformations. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and one by one, communist regimes in Eastern Europe collapsed. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, officially ending the Cold War. Bush skillfully managed these transitions, emphasizing diplomacy and avoiding triumphalism that might have provoked instability. Bush also faced challenges closer to home. The economy entered a recession, and despite his famous pledge, "Read my lips, no new taxes," he agreed to a budget deal that included tax increases, angering his conservative base. Internationally, Bush's leadership shone during the Gulf War. In 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait, threatening global oil supplies. Bush assembled a broad international coalition and launched Operation Desert Storm in early 1991. The campaign swiftly liberated Kuwait, and Bush's approval ratings soared. Yet, despite his foreign policy successes, economic worries and a perception of detachment from domestic issues hurt Bush's re-election chances. In 1992, he faced a dynamic challenger who promised change and economic revitalization. That challenger was Bill Clinton, a young Democratic governor from Arkansas who won the presidency amid promises to focus on the economy, famously summarized by the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." Clinton represented a generational shift and ushered in an era of relative peace and prosperity. During his presidency, the economy boomed. Unemployment and inflation dropped, and the federal government achieved budget surpluses. Clinton reformed welfare, signed free trade agreements like NAFTA, and presided over the explosion of the Internet age. However, Clinton's presidency was marred by personal scandals. His affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1998 on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. He was acquitted by the Senate and completed his second term with high approval ratings, but the scandal cast a long shadow. As the 20th century drew to a close, the presidency had evolved once again. The Cold War was over, globalization was accelerating, and American power seemed unchallenged. But peace and prosperity would soon give way to new and unforeseen trials as the nation entered the 21st century. As America entered the 21st century, the presidency faced new and terrifying challenges. In the contentious 2000 election, the nation found itself in political limbo. The race between George W. Bush, son of former President George H. W. Bush, and Vice President Al Gore came down to the state of Florida. After weeks of legal battles and a Supreme Court decision in Bush versus Gore, George W. Bush assumed the presidency in January 2001. Bush's early presidency focused on domestic issues, including tax cuts and education reform. But everything changed on September 11, 2001. On that tragic morning, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and another, after passengers fought back, into a field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 people died. The attack shattered America's sense of security and transformed Bush's presidency overnight. In response, Bush declared a global war on terror. The United States invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban regime and destroy Al-Qaeda's safe haven. Initially successful, the war dragged on for years as insurgencies took root. In 2003, Bush expanded the conflict by launching an invasion of Iraq, citing fears that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Though Saddam's regime fell quickly, no such weapons were found, and the ensuing chaos sparked years of violent insurgency. Bush's foreign policy divided the nation and the world. Some praised his decisive action against terrorism, while others criticized the wars as costly and misguided. At home, his administration faced crises like Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which devastated New Orleans and exposed government failures in disaster response. In 2008, as the global economy teetered on the brink of collapse, Americans turned to a new leader promising hope and change. Barack Obama, a first-term senator from Illinois, made history as the nation's first African-American president. Obama's election was a moment of profound national significance. His presidency began amid the Great Recession, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Obama championed a massive economic stimulus, bailed out the auto industry, and pushed through sweeping financial reforms. Perhaps his most ambitious domestic achievement was the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, passed in 2010. Designed to expand healthcare coverage, it became one of the most consequential and controversial laws in modern U.S. history. Supporters hailed it as a step toward universal healthcare, while opponents decried it as government overreach. In foreign affairs, Obama shifted the focus. He wound down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, though conflicts simmered on. In 2011, U.S. forces killed Osama bin Laden, mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, a major symbolic victory. Yet Obama's presidency also faced deep divisions. Partisan gridlock became routine, and the rise of movements like the Tea Party reflected growing frustration with government. Meanwhile, racial tensions re-emerged as police shootings and protests dominated headlines. In 2016, after 8 years of Obama's leadership, the nation once again chose change, this time in the form of a political outsider. Donald J. Trump, a billionaire businessman and reality television star, won the presidency in a stunning and polarizing upset. Trump's presidency broke with many traditions. His use of Twitter as a direct communication tool, his confrontational rhetoric, and his focus on nationalism, embodied by slogans like "America First," energized his supporters and alarmed his critics. Trump pursued aggressive policies on immigration, trade, and deregulation. He withdrew from international agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord, and took a tough stance on China. His administration saw record-low unemployment before the COVID-19 pandemic struck in early 2020. The pandemic became the defining crisis of Trump's term. His handling of the public health emergency and its economic fallout deeply divided Americans. Simultaneously, the nation faced widespread protests against racial injustice after the killing of George Floyd. In 2020, amid unprecedented voter turnout and a contentious election, Joe Biden, Obama's former vice president, defeated Trump. Trump refused to concede, and on January 6, 2021, a violent mob of his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the election results, the most serious attack on the peaceful transfer of power since the Civil War. Despite this dark chapter, Biden was inaugurated later that month, pledging to heal a deeply divided nation. As the first president to take office amid a global pandemic and in the aftermath of such turmoil, Biden faced immense challenges. He oversaw a massive vaccination campaign, sought to rebuild alliances abroad, and passed major legislation on infrastructure and climate change. Yet polarization remained high, and the presidency continued to reflect the nation's ideological divides. By the early 2020s, the office of president had evolved yet again. Once viewed as a figurehead or cautious steward, the modern president was now a global leader, policymaker, and often a cultural lightning rod, tasked not just with governing, but with uniting an increasingly fractured society. As the 2020s continued, Joe Biden's presidency entered a complex and often turbulent period that mirrored the evolving nature of the United States itself. Global crises, domestic polarization, economic uncertainty, and a rapidly shifting media landscape created unprecedented challenges for the leader of the free world. Biden's administration prioritized unity, public health, and economic recovery in the wake of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. Vaccination programs rolled out at record speed. Restrictions eased, and by 2022, much of American life cautiously returned to normal. Still, the scars remained, politically, socially, and economically. In foreign affairs, Biden faced renewed global instability. His decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan ended America's longest war, but the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and chaotic evacuation efforts drew sharp criticism at home and abroad. the move reignited debates about American interventionism and the limits of presidential power in shaping global outcomes. Meanwhile, a new crisis emerged in Europe. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, sparking the largest conflict on the continent since World War II. Biden rallied NATO allies, imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, and provided Ukraine with military aid, reinforcing the president's role as commander of international coalitions and protector of democratic values. Domestically, Biden's legislative victories reflected shifting priorities. He signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, aimed at modernizing roads, bridges, and broadband access, and passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included historic investments in clean energy and healthcare. However, fierce partisan battles and a closely divided Congress made every achievement hard-won. At the same time, social and cultural divisions deepened. Debates over voting rights, abortion access, gun control, and racial justice often left the nation bitterly split. The presidency, once seen as a symbol of unity, now found itself at the epicenter of cultural wars, admired and vilified in equal measure depending on political perspective. Technological change also reshaped the presidency. Social media, once a tool for outreach, became a battleground of misinformation and outrage. Presidents, including Biden, had to navigate an environment where public opinion could shift instantly, and narratives were shaped as much by viral posts as by official speeches. The rise of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity threats, and global competition in tech added new responsibilities to the already overwhelming presidential portfolio. As Biden's term progressed, America prepared for yet another contentious election cycle, underscoring a reality that had become undeniable. The presidency was no longer merely about policy or leadership. It had become a mirror reflecting the nation's hopes, fears, and divisions. Looking back, the journey from George Washington's humble beginnings to the media-saturated, globally intertwined presidency of the 21st century is staggering. Each president left a unique imprint. Some, like Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Reagan, led during transformational eras, reshaping the nation in profound ways. Others, like Adams, Buchanan, or Ford, presided during more difficult, often turbulent times. Yet every president, regardless of success or failure, has participated in an extraordinary experiment, proving that the peaceful transfer of power, government by the people, and the promise of democratic leadership can endure, adapt, and prevail. Today, the presidency faces challenges the founders could scarcely imagine. Climate change, pandemics, global economic interdependence, and deep domestic divides make the job more complex and scrutinized than ever. And yet the core idea endures, that in a nation built on ideals, no leader is above the people, and every 4 years, ultimate authority returns to them. As the story of U.S. presidents continues, one truth remains: the person who sits in the Oval Office is not merely the most powerful individual in the world, they are also the custodian of a fragile and resilient democracy, shaped by centuries of triumphs, mistakes, courage, and compromise. What comes next in this story is still unwritten. But whoever takes the oath of office in the years ahead will join a lineage shaped by history, and will carry the enduring burden of leading a nation that still believes in its own possibility. The story of U.S. presidents is far from over. New leaders will rise, face new trials, and leave their marks on history. Which era shaped America the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more captivating stories, and share it with fellow history lovers. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring the past to understand the future.